The water is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than ice, kept liquid only by the salt. You are floating in it, wearing a life jacket that keeps your head above water, but nothing else. Around you, in the darkness of the North Atlantic, 1,500 other people are doing the same thing, thrashing, screaming, praying, dying. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable has just disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it the lights, the warmth, the hope that the lifeboats are out there somewhere, but they're not coming back. The people in them can hear you screaming, but they're too afraid to return afraid. The drowning will swamp their boats, will drag them down too. So they wait, and they listen, and they do nothing while 1,500 people freeze to death in the darkness. You have perhaps 15 minutes, maybe 20 if you're strong. The cold is already shutting down your body, pulling blood away from your limbs, slowing your heart, clouding your mind. You're not going to drown. The life jacket will keep your face above water. You're going to freeze, fully conscious. Listening to the screens around you grow quieter and quieter until there's only silence. Welcome to the Titanic. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into historical darkness. And if you're already subscribed, you know the drill. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. And honestly, the people in that water could have used a little more help too. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. You're freezing to death in the North Atlantic, and the largest moving object ever built by human hands is sinking beneath you. The RMS Titanic has become the most famous shipwreck in history, a symbol of hubris, of class inequality, of the thin line between triumph and tragedy. The story has been told countless times. The iceberg, the band playing on, the women and children first. But the reality was more complicated, more horrifying, and more human than the legend suggests. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a floating city, a microcosm of Edwardian society, with its rigid class divisions and its unshakable confidence in progress. When it sank on April 15, 1912, it took with it not just 1,500 lives, but an entire worldview. The belief that technology had conquered nature, that wealth meant safety, that the future would be better than the past. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore what really happened on that ship and in that water, the design flaws and the human errors, the heroes and the cowards, the first-class passengers in their evening gowns and the third-class passengers locked behind gates, the band that really did keep playing, and the 1,500 people who died in water so cold that rescue was never really possible. This is the brutal reality of life and death on the Titanic. Get comfortable. The iceberg is waiting. The Titanic was born from competition. The White Star Line, one of Britain's premier shipping companies, was locked in a battle with Cunard for dominance of the North Atlantic passenger trade. Cunard had speed. White Star would counter with size and luxury. The plan, conceived in 1907 over dinner between White Star chairman J. Bruce Ismay and Lord Purry of the Harland and Wolff shipyard, was audacious. 3 massive ships, larger than anything afloat, that would redefine ocean travel. They would be called Olympic, Titanic, and gigantic names that announced their ambition to the world. The Titanic was the second of the 3, and she was designed to be the finest ship ever built. At 882 feet long and 92 feet wide, She displaced 46,000 tons, the largest moving object ever created by human hands. Her hull contained enough steel to build a small city. Her engines produced 46,000 horsepower. Her funnels rose 81 feet above the deck. But size alone was not the selling point. The Titanic was marketed as a floating palace, offering accommodations that rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. First-class passengers could enjoy a swimming pool, a Turkish bath, a squash court, a gymnasium with mechanical horses, and a grand staircase that descended through 6 decks beneath a glass dome. The ship was also marketed as safe, practically unsinkable in the language of the time. Her hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, and she could float with any 2 compartments flooded, or even the first 4. The shipbuilders and the press were so confident in this design that the word unsinkable became attached to the Titanic, though White Star itself was careful never to make that exact claim. Construction took 3 years and the labor of 15,000 workers. 8 men died building her. When she was launched on May 31st, 1911, she was the largest ship the world had ever seen. And when she set sail on her maiden voyage, on April 10th, 1912, she carried the dreams of an empire. The Titanic was not one ship, but 3, stacked on top of each other like layers of a cake. The quality of your voyage, and ultimately your chances of survival, depended entirely on how much you had paid. First class occupied the upper decks, the prime real estate of the ship. Here, millionaires and aristocrats enjoyed cabins that resembled luxury hotel suites, with private bathrooms, sitting rooms, and promenade decks where they could stroll in the sea air. The most expensive suite cost £870, about $100,000 in today's money, for a one-way crossing. The first-class passenger list read like a who's who of the Gilded Age. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship and one of the richest in the world. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to the mining fortune. Isidore and Ida Strauss, co-owners of Macy's department store. The Countess of Rothes. Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon. These were people accustomed to having the world arranged for their convenience. Second class occupied the middle decks. These passengers were professionals, merchants, teachers, the respectable middle class of Edwardian society. Their accommodations were comfortable, if not luxurious, comparable to first class on lesser ships. They had their own dining room, their own library, their own promenade. Third-class steerage was in the lower decks, near the engines and the cargo holds. Here, immigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, Syria, and elsewhere traveled to start new lives in America. They slept in dormitories, ate simple food, and had access to only a small section of deck space. A third-class ticket cost about £7, roughly $700 today. The classes were kept strictly separate. Gates and barriers prevented third-class passengers from wandering into first-class areas. They ate different food, breathed different air, lived in different worlds, all on the same ship. This separation would have deadly consequences when the ship began to sink. If you're enjoying this journey toward disaster, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise we'll reach the iceberg soon enough. The Titanic departed Southampton, England, on April 10, 1912, at noon. Almost immediately, disaster nearly struck. As the massive ship moved through the harbor, her displacement created suction that pulled the nearby liner SS New York from its moorings. The two ships came within 4 feet of colliding. Only quick action by a tugboat prevented what would have been a crushing embarrassment before the voyage even began. Some passengers saw this near miss as an omen. They should have listened to Dot from Southampton. The Titanic crossed the English Channel to Cherbourg, France, where more passengers boarded via tender. The ship was too large for the harbor. Then on to Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland, where the last passengers embarked, many of them Irish emigrants seeking new lives in America. A photograph taken from the shore shows the Titanic departing Queenstown, the last image of the ship before the disaster. The first days of the voyage were pleasant, even magical. The weather was calm, the ship steady, the service impeccable. Passengers explored the vessel, marveling at its size and luxury. They ate in the grand dining rooms, swam in the heated pool, attended church services in the first-class lounge. Captain Edward John Smith, 62 years old and on his final voyage before retirement, was a reassuring presence, a veteran of 40 years at sea, beloved by passengers and crew alike. He had commanded the Titanic's sister ship Olympic, and White Star trusted him with their newest and finest vessel. Wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride stayed busy transmitting messages for passengers' stock prices, business deals, social telegrams to friends ashore. The wireless was a novelty, and wealthy passengers used it liberally. This volume of personal traffic would later have fatal consequences. Titanic received ice warnings throughout April 14, 1912. At least 6 messages arrived that day from other ships reporting icebergs and field ice in the ship's path. These warnings were not ignored exactly, but neither were they treated with the urgency they deserved. The first warning came from the office. Coronia at 9 a.m. Ice reported at 42N to 51W. Captain Smith acknowledged this message and posted it for his officers. Throughout the day, more warnings followed from the Baltic, the America, the Californian, and others. Each reported ice in or near the Titanic's planned route. The problem was systemic. The wireless operators worked for the Marconi Company, not White Star, and their primary job was transmitting passenger messages, not relaying navigation information. Ice warnings were routine. Ships encountered ice in the North Atlantic regularly, and there was no established protocol for handling them. At 9:40 p.m., the Mesaba sent a particularly urgent warning describing heavy pack ice and icebergs directly in the Titanic's path. This message never reached the bridge. Wireless operator Jack Phillips was overwhelmed with passenger traffic. The ship had been out of range of the Cape Race Station and was now rushing to transmit a backlog of messages. He set the Mesaba warning aside. At 11 p.m., the Californian stopped for the night due to ice, tried to warn the Titanic. Phillips, exhausted and irritated, cut off the transmission. "Shut up. I am busy." The Californian's operator gave up and went to bed. His ship was less than 20 miles away. The Titanic's lookouts had been warned to watch for ice, but they had no binoculars. The glasses had been locked in a cabinet, and the key was not aboard. They would have to spot icebergs with their naked eyes on a moonless night, in a calm sea that showed no waves breaking against obstacles. At 11:39 p.m. on April 14, 1912, Lookout Frederick Fleet spotted something directly ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch reacted instantly. He ordered the helm hard to starboard, which, in the reversed steering convention of the time, meant turning the ship to port or left and rang the engine telegraph for full reverse. The ship began to turn, slowly, agonizingly slowly. For 37 seconds, the Titanic swung to port. It looked like she might clear the iceberg. But the berg was massive, about 100 feet tall, and perhaps 10 times that below the waterline, and the ship was too close, moving too fast. At 11:40 p.m., the starboard side of the Titanic scraped along the underwater spur of the iceberg. The collision was almost gentle. Passengers in their cabins felt a slight shudder, a grinding vibration. Some described it as like a train applying brakes, or as if someone had drawn a giant finger along the side of the ship. Many didn't notice it at all. It seemed, at first, like nothing. But below the waterline, the damage was catastrophic. The iceberg had not punched a hole in the hull. It had buckled the plates and popped the rivets, opening a series of narrow gashes along 300 feet of the ship's starboard side. Water began pouring in at a rate of 7 tons per second. Captain Smith arrived on the bridge within minutes and began assessing the damage. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who was aboard for the maiden voyage, accompanied him on an inspection of the lower decks. What they found was devastating. The first 5 compartments were flooding. The ship could stay afloat with 4 compartments breached, but not 5. The mathematics were inexorable. Andrews delivered the verdict. Titanic would sink. It was a certainty. They had perhaps an hour, maybe 2. If you're settling in for the night, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. Because we're about to confront the arithmetic that doomed 1,500 people, the Titanic carried 2,224 people on her maiden voyage, approximately 1,317 passengers and 907 crew members. She carried lifeboat capacity for 1,178 people, just over half those aboard, Dot. This was not an oversight or an error. The Board of Trade Regulations, dating from 1894, required ships over 10,000 tons to carry 16 lifeboats with capacity for 962 people. The Titanic exceeded this requirement, carrying 20 boats with total capacity of 1,178. By the standards of the time, she was over-equipped. The problem was that the regulations had not kept pace with ship size. They had been written when the largest ships were a fraction of the Titanic's tonnage. The rules assumed that in the busy North Atlantic shipping lanes, lifeboats would serve as ferries to nearby rescue ships, not as the sole means of survival. They assumed help would always be close, at hand. White Star's naval architect, Alexander Carlisle, had originally proposed 64 lifeboats for the Olympic-class ships, enough for everyone aboard. The design was rejected as excessive and unsightly. The boat deck would look too cluttered. Passengers might become anxious at the sight of so many lifeboats. The decision was made to carry fewer boats that could hold the passengers. In a ship marketed as practically unsinkable, no. In the early hours of April 15, 1912, the mathematics became inescapable. Even if every lifeboat were launched full to capacity, more than 1,000 people would have nowhere to go. In practice, the boats would be launched half empty, and the death toll would be even worse. The design of the ship, the regulations of the day, and the assumptions of the age had created a death trap. Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, and J. Bruce Ismay now knew the truth. They did not have enough boats, not even close. 12:05 a.m. on April 15, 1912. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered. At 12:20 a.m., he gave the order that would define the disaster: women and children first. This was not a regulation or a legal requirement. It was a Victorian social code, an expectation that in any emergency, men would sacrifice themselves for women and children. On the Titanic, it was interpreted differently on different parts of the ship, with vastly different results. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Littler enforced the rule strictly: women and children only. Men were turned away at gunpoint, even when boats were being lowered with empty seats. Littler would rather send a boat down half full than allow a man to take a place. Some boats left with barely 20 people in craft, designed to hold 65. On the starboard side, First Officer William Murdoch interpreted the rule more flexibly: women and children first. But men could board if there were no women waiting. His boats left more full, but still not to capacity in the confusion and darkness. It was hard to know whether more women might be coming. The result was chaos and waste. Lifeboat No. 1 was launched with only 12 people aboard capacity 40. The boat contained Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, Lady Duff Gordon's secretary, and 9 crew members. Sir Cosmo would later be accused of bribing the crew not to return for survivors. The early boats were the emptiest. Passengers did not yet believe the ship was sinking. The lights were still on. The deck was nearly level. The band was playing ragtime. Many women refused to leave their husbands. Some passengers thought the lifeboats were more dangerous than the unsinkable ship. They would realize their mistake too late. The class divisions that had organized life on the Titanic now organized death. While first-class passengers were escorted to the boat deck, third-class passengers found themselves trapped in a labyrinth. The ship's design physically separated the classes, and these barriers remained in place during the sinking. Third-class passengers had to navigate unfamiliar corridors, climb multiple stairways, and pass through gates that were sometimes locked, not as a deliberate death sentence, but because U.S. immigration law required steerage, passengers to be kept separate for medical inspection upon arrival. Whether these gates were locked during the sinking remains controversial. Some survivors testified they were. Others said they found open routes to the deck. What is certain is that third-class passengers received no organized assistance. There were no stewards directing them to lifeboats, no officers explaining what was happening. Many didn't even know the ship was sinking until water was flooding their compartments. Language was another barrier. Third class included passengers from Ireland, Scandinavia, Syria, Armenia, and elsewhere. Many spoke little or no English. Announcements and instructions were largely useless to them. They were on their own in a foreign ship, in a disaster they didn't understand. The statistics tell the story. In first class, 62% of passengers survived. In second class, 41%. In third class, only 25%. Among third-class men, the survival rate was a mere 16%. Among third-class children, it was 34% lower than first-class men, who served at 33%. These numbers are not accidental. They reflected the priorities of Edwardian society, encoded in the ship's architecture and enforced in its final hours. Some lives were worth more than others, and the Titanic made sure everyone knew it. If you're still with me as the ship goes down, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives. And speaking of things that continued to the end, let's talk about the band. The Titanic's musicians were not employees of White Star but contracted through a Liverpool agency. There were 8 of them, led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley, and they had no emergency duties. When the sinking began, they were not required to do anything except save themselves. Instead, they played. They assembled in the first-class lounge around 12:15 a.m. and began performing to calm the passengers. As the ship listed more severely, they moved to the boat deck and continued playing in the open air. They played waltzes, ragtime, popular songs, anything to maintain a sense of normalcy in the gathering chaos. The exact repertoire is uncertain. The myth that they played Nearer, My God, to Thee, as the ship went down comes from survivor accounts, but witnesses disagreed on whether this was true. Some heard hymns. Others heard ragtime until the end. What everyone agreed on was that the band kept playing long after they could have, sought places in the boats. All 8 musicians died. Their bodies were recovered in the following days. Hartley's was found still wearing his bandsman's uniform. His violin was strapped to his body. He was 33 years old. The band's sacrifice became one of the most enduring legends of the disaster. They had no obligation to stay, no duty to perform, no reason to die, except their own sense of professionalism and courage. They chose to spend their final hours doing what they did best, providing comfort to people who were about to die. Whether this was heroism or fatalism, or simply the inability to comprehend what was happening, the band played on while the Titanic sank beneath them. By 1:30 a.m. The Titanic's bow was noticeably lower, the stern rising. The ship's lights, which had blazed throughout the sinking, began to flicker. The angle of the deck made standing difficult. The end was clearly near. The last lifeboats were being loaded in increasing desperation. Officers fired pistols into the air and possibly into the crowd to maintain order. Hundreds of passengers now understood they would not find places in the boats. Some jumped overboard, hoping to swim to the lifeboats. Most waited, paralyzed by fear or dignity or disbelief. 2:05 a.m. Collapsible D, the last lifeboat successfully launched, pulled away from the ship. It carried 44 people. More than 1,500 remained aboard. Captain Smith released the crew from their duties. It's every man for himself now. His final moments are uncertain. Some say he was seen swimming toward a lifeboat with a child. Others that he walked onto the bridge and went down with his ship. His body was never recovered. Thomas Andrews, the designer, was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting, his life jacket lying unused on a table. He had known from the first inspection that the ship was doomed. He had spent the night helping women and children into the boats, but he made no effort to save himself. He was 39 years old. Bruce Ismay, the White Star chairman whose dinner conversation had conceived the Titanic, found a place in one of the last boats. He would spend the rest of his life defending this decision and living with the accusations that he had saved himself while others died. He withdrew from public life and died in 1937, broken by the disaster. At 2:17 a.m., the Titanic's lights went out for the last time. In darkness, the end came. What happened next was witnessed by hundreds of people in lifeboats, and thousands of miles away would be debated for decades. The ship broke in two. As the bow flooded and sank deeper, the stern rose out of the water, lifting the massive propellers into the air. The structural stress was immense. The ship was never designed to be supported only at its midpoint, while the bow pulled it down and the stern hung in the air dot at approximately 2:18 a.m. The hull failed. The ship broke between the third and fourth funnels, the metal screaming as it tore apart. The stern section, momentarily released from the weight of the bow, settled back toward level. Passengers who had climbed to the stern, hoping to stay out of the water as long as possible, had a brief respite. Then the bow, still attached by the keel, dragged the stern vertical again. For a moment, the stern stood nearly perpendicular to the water, a black silhouette against the stars. Before beginning its final plunge, survivors in the lifeboats watched in horror. They heard the sounds, the crashing of everything loose inside the ship, the screaming of those still aboard, the thunderous roar of air escaping from the hull. Second Officer Lytler described it as a death rattle. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the Atlantic. She had been afloat for less than 3 hours since the collision. She would lie on the ocean floor 12,500 feet down for the next 73 years until her discovery in 1985. But the disaster was not over. It was only beginning its most terrible phase. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment about what historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Because now we need to discuss what happened to the people who went into the water dot when the Titanic sank. Approximately 1,500 people were thrown or jumped into the North Atlantic. They wore life jackets that would keep them afloat. They did not know that floating would not save them. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius, below the freezing point of fresh water, kept liquid only by its salt content. At this temperature, the human body begins to shut down almost immediately. Cold shock causes gasping and hyperventilation. Blood vessels in the extremities constrict to preserve core temperature. The heart races, then slows. Muscles weaken. Consciousness fades. The textbook survival time in 28 degrees Fahrenheit water is 15 to 45 minutes. But this assumes the person remains still. The victims in the water did not remain still. They thrashed, they swam, they struggled. They burned through their energy reserves faster. Many died in less than 15 minutes. The sounds from the water haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. One described it as a long, continuous wailing chant. Hundreds of voices crying for help, praying, screaming, calling out names. The sound carried clearly across the flat. Calm sea to the lifeboats waiting in the darkness. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe was one of the few who went back. He transferred passengers from his lifeboat to others, then rowed back toward the screaming. By the time he arrived, almost everyone was dead. He pulled 4 people from the water. One of them died shortly after. The others found only bodies floating in their life jackets, frozen in the positions of their final moments. The screaming lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Then silence fell over the water, a silence broken only by the lapping of waves and the distant weeping in the lifeboats. The lifeboats that could have saved hundreds chose not to return. This was perhaps the most damning human failure of the disaster. 20 lifeboats had been launched, carrying approximately 710 people. Most had room for more, some had room for dozens more. They floated within earshot of feeding, and most did nothing. The fear was rational, but not excusable. The people in the lifeboats believed correctly that desperate swimmers might swamp their boats in the struggle to climb aboard. Dozens of panicked people grabbing at a single lifeboat could capsize it, dooming the people already saved. The officers and crew in most boats decided the risk was too great. Margaret Molly Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, argued furiously with Quartermaster Robert Hickens in Lifeboat No. 6 that they should go back. Hickens refused, claiming they would be swamped. Brown threatened to throw him overboard. They did not return. Fifth Officer Lowe, as mentioned, was the exception. He took the time to redistribute passengers and then rowed back. By then it was too late for almost everyone. His rescue of 4 people, 3 of whom survived, proved that return was possible. But his example was not followed. Some boats began picking up bodies instead of survivors, hoping to identify the dead and recover valuables. Others drifted, their occupants too shocked or too cold to do anything but wait. The temperature on that clear April night was just above freezing, and the people in the lifeboats, many wearing only evening clothes, suffered severely. They waited 4 hours until rescue arrived. 4 hours in open boats, listening to silence where screaming had been, watching for a ship that might never come. Less than 20 miles away, the ship Californian lay stopped for the night, surrounded by the same ice field that had destroyed the Titanic. Her crew saw the rockets. They saw the lights. They did nothing. The Californian had stopped at 10:21 p.m. after encountering ice. Her wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had tried to warn the Titanic only to be told to shut up. Evans went to bed at 11:30 p.m., and the Californian's wireless went silent, but her crew was still awake, and they saw things. Second Officer Herbert Stone and Apprentice James Gibson watched the lights of a large ship to the south lights that appeared, then began to behave strangely. Stone saw what he interpreted as rockets, white lights exploding in the sky. He reported them to Captain Stanley Lord. Captain Lord asked if the rockets were Company Signals private fireworks ships, sometimes used for identification. Stone said he didn't know. Lord told him to keep watching and tried to contact the ship by Morse lamp. Then Lord went back to sleep. Over the next 2 hours, Stone and Gibson watched 8 rockets explode over the distant ship. They watched the ship's lights seem to change position, as if the vessel were listing or turning. They watched the lights disappear. They did nothing. Was the ship they saw the Titanic? The Californian's crew denied it for decades, claiming the rockets were too low on the horizon, the ship too small. Modern analysis suggests they were almost certainly watching the Titanic sink. Captain Lord could have reached the scene in time to save hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 lives. He didn't. The inquiry called his inaction reprehensible. He spent the rest of his life insisting he had done nothing wrong. The rescue came from the Carpathia, a Cunard liner en route from New York to Gibraltar. Her wireless operator, Harold Cottam, happened to be awake past his normal hours and happened to catch the Titanic's distress call at 12:25 a.m. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia responded immediately. He ordered his ship turned around, all available speed engaged, and every preparation made for rescue. The Carpathia was 58 miles away, nearly 4 hours at her maximum, speed of 14 knots. Rostron's preparation was exemplary. He ordered all hot water directed to provide tea, coffee, and soup for survivors. He had blankets, medical supplies, and clothing readied. He assigned specific tasks to every officer and crew member. He plotted a course through the ice field, posting extra lookouts and proceeding as fast as he dared through the heat. Dangerous waters dot the Carpathia dodged icebergs through the night, her crew straining to see the hazards that had destroyed the Titanic. Rostron pushed his old ship beyond her design limits, coaxing 17 knots from engines. Rated for 14, he arrived at the lifeboats at 4:10 a.m. faster than anyone had thought possible. The sight that greeted the Carpathia's crew was heartbreaking. Small boats scattered across miles of ocean, some packed with people, some nearly empty. Passengers in evening dress, women in nightgowns, children in blankets. All of them frozen, exhausted, traumatized. And around the boats, hundreds of bodies floating in life jackets, bobbing gently in the calm sea. One by one, the Carpathia took the lifeboat survivors aboard. The process took hours. By 8:30 a.m., it was done. 710 survivors had been rescued. More than 1,500 had not. If you're still listening, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we need to see this disaster through the eyes of those who lived. The survivors arrived in New York on April 18, 1912, to a city in shock. 40,000 people lined the waterfront. The Carpathia docked at Pier 54, and the survivors disembarked into a forest of flashbulbs and shouting reporters. The trauma was immediate and lasting. Many survivors suffered what we would now call PTSD nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt. Some never spoke of the disaster again. Others could not stop speaking of it, replaying the night endlessly in their minds. The physical toll was severe. Many survivors had frostbite from their hours in the lifeboats. Some lost fingers or toes. Others developed pneumonia or other illnesses from the exposure. Several survivors died within weeks of the rescue, their bodies unable to recover. The emotional wounds were worse. Women who had stepped into lifeboats leaving husbands behind had to live with that choice forever. Children who had lost parents faced a future without guidance or support. Crew members who had survived while passengers died faced accusations of cowardice. Some survivors became famous. The unsinkable Molly Brown lectured about the disaster and campaigned for maritime safety. J. Bruce Ismay became infamous, vilified for surviving while others died. The Navartel orphans, 2 French boys whose father had kidnapped them and died in the sinking, became a sensation until their mother was located. Others disappeared into anonymity, wanting only to forget. They changed their names, moved to new cities, never told their families what they had experienced. The disaster had broken something in them that could not be repaired. The Titanic's dead included some of the richest and most powerful people in the world. Their deaths shocked a society that believed wealth could protect against anything. John Jacob Astor IV was the richest person aboard, worth approximately $85 million in $1,912, several billion today. He was 47 years old, traveling with his pregnant 18-year-old second wife, Madeline. When the ship began sinking, he helped Madeline into a lifeboat, then asked if he might join her given her delicate condition. He was told no male passengers could board. He stepped back, lit a cigarette, and was never seen alive again. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to the mining fortune, responded to the disaster with aristocratic fatalism. He and his valet dressed in their finest evening clothes. "We are dressed in our best," he reportedly said, "and are prepared to go down as gentlemen." They did. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple who co-owned Macy's, refused to be separated. Ida was offered a seat in a lifeboat, but would not leave her husband. "We have lived together for many years," she reportedly said. "Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the ship went down. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, spent his final hours helping others and made no attempt to save himself. He knew better than anyone how the ship would sink, how long it would take, how many would die. He had built the death trap, and he died in it. Captain Smith's final moments remain uncertain, but he did not survive. His body was never found. He was 62 years old, on what was supposed to be his final voyage before a comfortable retirement. Within days of the disaster, investigations began on both sides of the Atlantic. The inquiries would expose the failures that had led to the tragedy and result in reforms that would save countless future lives. The U.S. Senate investigation began on April 19th, while survivors were still arriving. Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan led the inquiry, questioning over 80 witnesses, including J. Bruce Ismay, the surviving officers, and numerous passengers and crew. The hearings were public, dramatic, and sometimes accusatory. The British Board of Trade inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, began on May 2nd. It was more technical, focusing on the ship's design, the navigation decisions, and the regulatory framework that had allowed a ship with insufficient lifeboats to sail. Both inquiries reached similar conclusions. The ship had been traveling too fast in dangerous conditions. The ice warnings had not been properly heeded. The lifeboats had been insufficient and improperly loaded. The Californian had failed to respond to distress signals. Multiple failures had compounded into catastrophe. The recommendations were comprehensive. Ships must carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Lifeboat drills must be mandatory. Wireless equipment must be operated 24 hours a day. The International Ice Patrol must be established to track icebergs in the North Atlantic. These reforms were implemented quickly. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, first adopted in 1914, codified many of the lessons learned from the Titanic. It has been updated many times since, but its origins lie in that April night in 1912. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we need to discuss what happened to the 1,500 people who died and their remains. The bodies began washing up almost immediately. The Mackay Bennett, a cable-laying ship chartered by White Star, departed Halifax on April 17th to recover the dead. Over the following weeks, it and other ships recovered 337 bodies from the sea. The recovery crews faced grim decisions. They had been provided with embalming supplies, but not enough for everyone. Priority was given to first-class passengers, whose wealthy families would demand proper burials. Third-class passengers and crew members were often buried at sea after being photographed and searched for identification. Of the 337 bodies recovered, 119 were buried at sea. The remaining 218 were brought to Halifax, where they were identified if possible and claimed by families. Some were transported to hometowns across the United States, Canada, and Europe. Others, those who couldn't be identified or claimed, were buried in Halifax cemeteries. The identification process was painstaking. Workers cataloged every piece of clothing, every personal item, every physical characteristic. Some bodies were easily identified by their possessions or their faces. Others remained unknown, buried under markers that said simply unknown. John Jacob Astor's body was recovered, identified by the initials on his shirt collar and the fortune in cash and valuables in his pockets. Captain Smith's body was never found. Of the 1,500 plus dead, more than 1,100 were never recovered. They sank with the ship or drifted away in the current, or simply dissolved into the cold Atlantic waters. The Titanic lay undiscovered for 73 years. A ghost ship on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, 12,500 feet beneath the surface. Numerous expeditions had searched for the wreck, but the technology to reach such depths and search such vast areas did not exist until the 1980s. The ship could have been anywhere, within a search area of hundreds of square miles, in darkness so complete that artificial light was necessary. In 1985, a joint American-French expedition, led by Robert Ballard, finally found her. Using unmanned submersibles equipped with cameras, the team discovered the wreck on September 1st, 1985. The first images showed the bow, relatively intact, its railings and bollards recognizable from photographs taken 73 years before. The discovery revealed that the ship had broken in two during the sinking, something many survivors had reported, but which had been officially denied for decades. The bow and stern lay about 2,000 feet apart, with a debris field of personal items scattered between them. Shoes, cups, bottles, the small possessions of people who had expected to reach New York. The wreck has been visited many times since 1985 by scientists, filmmakers, and tourists. Thousands of artifacts have been recovered and exhibited. The site has been photographed and mapped in extraordinary detail. James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic was partly filmed at the actual wreck, but the ship is deteriorating. Bacteria are consuming the iron hull, creating delicate rusticles that collapse at a touch. Within decades, the Titanic will collapse into a pile of rust, her recognizable features gone. The wreck that survived 73 years undiscovered may not survive another 73. The Titanic sank over a century ago. Why does it still fascinate us? Why does this particular disaster, among thousands, maintain such a grip on the imagination? Part of the answer is the drama. The Titanic was the largest, most luxurious ship in the world, sunk on her maiden voyage. The hubris of calling her unsinkable followed the ultimate humiliation of sinking on the first trip. The iceberg appearing from darkness, the scramble for lifeboats, the band playing on every element of the story has the structure of tragedy. Part of the answer is the symbolism. The Titanic carried a cross-section of Edwardian society, from millionaires to immigrants. Its sinking revealed the costs of class division, the limits of technology, the fragility of the confidence that had characterized the age. It marked the end of an era. Just 2 years later, World War I would destroy the world the Titanic represented. Part of the answer is the human stories. The rich man who dressed for death, the elderly couple who refused to be parted, the band that kept playing, the crew members who held gates closed, the officers who shot into crowds, the survivors who never recovered. Every angle of the disaster reveals something about human nature under extreme stress. And part of the answer is simply that it could have been avoided. The ice warnings were there. The binoculars were locked away. The lifeboats were insufficient. The Californian didn't respond. At every turn, the disaster could have been prevented or mitigated, but wasn't. The Titanic haunts us because it was not fate, but failure. The Titanic has generated more myths than perhaps any other disaster. Some of the most famous stories are not quite true. The ship was never officially called Unsinkable by White Star. The company's promotional materials described her as designed to be unsinkable or practically unsinkable, hedged language that was interpreted more absolutely by the press and public. After the sinking, White Star was blamed for a claim it had never quite made. The band probably did not play Nearer, My God, to Thee as the ship went down. Survivor accounts conflict, with some reporting hymns and others reporting ragtime. The myth may have emerged because the hymn was Bandmaster Hartley's favorite, or because it made for a better story. What the band actually played in its final moments is unknown. Third-class passengers were not deliberately locked below to drown. The gates that separated classes were standard for the time and required by immigration law. Whether they remained locked during the sinking is disputed, but there is no evidence of a deliberate policy to sacrifice steerage for first class. The class disparities in survival resulted from geography. Third class was lower in the ship and the chaos of the evacuation, not from murder. Captain Smith did not go down with the ship in the heroic sense often portrayed. His final movements are unknown, and various witnesses reported seeing him in different places. The myth of the captain saluting as the bridge went under is almost certainly invention. The Titanic did not sink in one piece. The ship broke apart during the sinking, as many survivors reported, but official inquiries in 1912 denied this, and the myth persisted until the wreck was discovered in 1985. If you're still with me at the end of this voyage, subscribe and leave a comment, because the Titanic's greatest legacy may be the lives it saved after its sinking. The International Ice Patrol was established in 1914 and continues to operate today, monitoring icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Since its founding, no ship that has heeded its warnings has been lost to ice. The patrol is funded by the 13 nations that use the North Atlantic. Route's a rare example of international cooperation that has endured for over a century. The requirement that ships carry lifeboats for everyone, aboard obvious in retrospect, became law only after the Titanic. Before 1912, the regulations had not kept pace with ship size. After 1912, the principle that every person must have a place was inviolable. The requirement for 24-hour wireless operation was another direct response. The Californian had seen the Titanic's rockets, but had not heard her. Distress calls because the wireless operator was asleep. Ships are now required to maintain continuous radio watch, and distress frequencies are monitored constantly. Lifeboat drills became mandatory. Before the Titanic, many ships never practiced launching boats or getting passengers to their stations. The Titanic herself held no lifeboat drill during her voyage. Now, drills are required within 24 hours of departure on any voyage. The SOLAS Convention, Safety of Life at Sea, was first adopted in 1914 as a direct response to the disaster. It has been updated many times after each new disaster revealing new vulnerabilities, but its foundation was the Titanic. Every regulation in SOLAS exists because someone, somewhere, at some time, died. The Titanic has inspired more books, films, songs, and artworks than any other disaster in history. It has become a permanent fixture in the cultural imagination, reinterpreted by each generation. The first films about the disaster appeared within months of the sinking. Saved from the Titanic, 1912. starred an actual survivor, Dorothy Gibson, wearing the same clothes she had worn in the lifeboat. It was rushed into theaters while public interest was at its peak. Since then, there have been dozens of Titanic films. From A Night to Remember 1958 to James Cameron's Titanic, 1997. Cameron's film became the highest-grossing movie in history at the time, earning over $2 billion worldwide. It introduced the disaster to a new generation and made the Titanic more famous than ever. The film won 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and its theme song became inescapable. The Titanic has also inspired music, from folk ballads written days after the sinking to Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On. Novels, including several, that predicted the disaster before it happened, and theatrical productions. It has been referenced in countless other works. Its name is synonym for doomed hubris. Museums around the world display Titanic artifacts and exhibitions. The wreck site has become a kind of underwater pilgrimage destination, visited by submersibles carrying tourists willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to see the remains. In 2023, a tourist submersible called Titan imploded while descending to the wreck, killing all 5 aboard. The disaster added another layer to the Titanic's legacy, a reminder that the ship remains dangerous, still claiming lives more than a century after it sank. That the Titanic's dead are not statistics. They were people with families, with dreams, with lives cut short by a combination of physics, design flaws, human error, and bad luck. We remember the famous Astor, Guggenheim, the Strausses, Andrews, Smith. Their wealth and status ensured their names would survive. We remember the heroes, the band, the wireless operators who stayed at their posts until the end, the officers who helped others into boats they knew they would not board themselves. We should also remember those whose names are less known, the Irish emigrants in steerage who had sold everything for a chance at a new life, the crew members who had signed on for a job and found themselves in a disaster, the children who died because lifeboats were lowered. Empty. We should remember that the Titanic was not an act of God, but an act of hubris. The ship was not unsinkable, but it was marketed that way. The lifeboats were not sufficient, but regulations did not require them to be. The ice warnings were received, but not heeded. The disaster was not fate, it was failure, and we should remember that from this failure came reform. The lives lost on April 15th, 1912, led directly to the regulations that have saved countless lives since. The International Ice Patrol, the lifeboat requirements, the radio watches, the safety conventions all exist because of what happened that night. That the Titanic's dead did not die in vain. They died because the systems that should have protected them failed. But their deaths forced those systems to change, and that change has protected everyone who has sailed the Atlantic since Dot, and so our voyage on the Titanic comes to an end. The ship lies on the ocean floor now, 12,500 feet down in darkness, so complete that no light has touched her since the morning of April 15th, 1912. The bow is recognizable, still the railings, the anchor chains, the shape of the vessel that was supposed to change ocean travel forever. The stern is a shattered ruin, torn apart when the ship broke in two, scattered across the seabed like the remnants of a dream. The bodies are gone, dissolved or drifted or consumed by the deep. The passengers who walked those decks, who ate in that dining room, who danced in that ballroom, they are memories now, photographs, names on a passenger list. They expected to arrive in New York. They never did. The water that killed them is still cold. The Atlantic at 41N, 49W is no warmer now than it was then. The ice still comes down from Greenland every spring, calving from glaciers, drifting south into the shipping lanes. The International Ice Patrol tracks it, warns ships, keeps them safe. The patrol exists because of what happened that night. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, consider what it was like. The collision that seemed like nothing. The realization that the ship was sinking. The scramble for lifeboats that could not hold everyone. The mathematics of death. Who would live and who would die, determined by class, by gender, by luck, by the placement of gates and stairways. Consider the people in the water, freezing in their life jackets, screaming for help that would not come. Consider the people in the lifeboats, listening to the screaming, choosing not to go back. Consider the people on the Californian, watching the rockets, doing nothing. Consider that it didn't have to happen. The warnings were there. The binoculars were available. The lifeboats could have been filled. A Californian could have responded. At every point, the disaster could have been prevented or reduced. It wasn't fate. It was failure. The Titanic teaches us that technology is not magic. That confidence is not competence. That the largest, most luxurious, most modern creation can be destroyed by ice and darkness and human error. That class privilege cannot protect against physics. That unsinkable is a word that tempts fate. But the Titanic also teaches us that humans can respond to tragedy with reform. That we can learn from disaster. That the dead can save the living if we let them doubt rest well tonight. Rest in a world made safer by the Titanic's dead, by the regulations written in their memory, by the ice patrols established because of their sacrifice, by the lifeboats that now hold everyone aboard. The ship is gone. The lesson remains. Sleep and remember them.